All right, you've been watching a CBS News special report. The Supreme Court of the United States has just ruled that President Trump's sweeping emergency tariffs are illegal. It was a 6-3 decision. The judges determined that the president does not have the power under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose those tariffs. I want to bring in CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman, who is also a lawyer. We also have on deck CBS News contributor Jessica Levinson to talk about this. But first to you, Katrina, let's talk about this. The Supreme Court ruling that, in fact, the president does not have the legal authority under what he was calling a national emergency, under national security threats, to impose tariffs on countries unilaterally. Break down this decision for us and explain to us what's sort of unique about this, which is that you have 3 conservative justices that joined 3 liberal justices to come down with this ruling.
Vlad, that's right. This is such a significant decision, as Jan Crawford was just talking about. The fact that these 3 liberal and 3 conservative justices came together and struck down something that is at the heart of President Trump's agenda, his tariffs. Now, one thing that stood out to me, I'm still reading through all of this, that is not really in this opinion, Vlad, and that people have been waiting for, is a discussion of refunds. What will happen with all of this money that has already been collected through the tariffs that President Trump imposed? And the only mention that I could even find of it was in a dissent from Justice Kavanaugh, where he brings up the fact that during the Supreme Court arguments, they acknowledged that these refunds would be a mess and that the court actually doesn't address it here. But a core part of this opinion, which was written by Chief Justice Roberts, is that he says that the power to tax is one that is a power of Congress, and that the president can't read into these words, regulate an importation that are in IEEPA, the statute that he used to impose these tariffs, and assert that power to impose tariffs. He says no president has ever done this before, and especially not in this broad, sweeping way that President Trump has. And he actually wrote regarding those words that the president tried to use from the statute. He said those words cannot bear such weight.
Let's go ahead and show the breakdown of the justices and where everybody came on this. We have Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, Jackson, Gorsuch, Barrett, and Roberts here with the concurring opinion striking down his ability to make these tariffs. And then we have Justices Thomas, Kavanaugh, and Alito who dissented. And I want also to show 2 phrases that we've been able to pull out. So this is the breakdown here. And then also, Matt, if we can pull up FS Opinion 2. And what strikes me here is where it says IEEPA's key phrase, the one the government relies on, says nothing about imposing tariffs or taxes. And then if we can bring up full screen Opinion 6, it says the government thus concedes the president enjoys no inherent authority to impose tariffs during peacetime. Have you been able to read the dissent yet, Katrina?
I have not been able to read the dissent yet, or there are multiple dissents. There's many opinions in this very, very over 100-page tariff opinion. And it shows the weight of this decision, the significance of this decision, Lindsay. But you're right, those are key aspects, the way that the president tried to read this particular law. And what the justices decided here is that the president has to point to clear congressional authorization. And they just say that that does not exist here. And having listened to the Supreme Court arguments, I'm also not surprised by this breakdown, even though it is unique for those justices to come together, because even those conservative justices were expressing a lot of concern, one about whether there is any distinction between the power to tax and the power to tariff, but also about what this means for presidential authority, for the separation of powers in the United States. If the president can essentially take a power that has been delegated to Congress and read it into a statute where they say that language just is not there.
All right, Katrina, stand by. I want to bring in CBS News contributor Jessica Levinson to talk more about the decision here, Jessica. So, Jessica, you may have seen a couple of days ago, we had Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson on CBS Mornings. And I'm not a lawyer, but all I did was I looked at the Constitution and I said, you know, Madam Justice, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Of course, as you know, duties and imposts being that 18th century term, that means U.S. customs charges and tariffs. And Now you've got the Supreme Court of the United States ruling, in fact, that the Constitution does not allow the president the power to impose these tariffs. What was so difficult about understanding that from the government's perspective, that the president does not have the ability to do that, since it's so clearly laid out in that article of the Constitution of the United States?
So I think you're exactly right to point us back to the fact that the Constitution gives the federal government only the powers that it gives it, by which I mean that the federal government is a government that functions based on enumerated powers. You can't do anything unless the Constitution tells you that you can. It's not like states. States have general powers, something called sovereign powers or police powers. So what happens in this case, the majority of the court looks at the Constitution, they look at the statute, and they say to not just this president, but any president, no, you can't. You cannot use this statute to impose taxes. And if I could briefly summarize what you've already been talking about, it's that, Vlad, as you just said, the Constitution says Congress gets to impose taxes. Congress gets to regulate foreign commerce. Congress gets to regulate domestic commerce, interstate commerce. Now, when could that change? And this was a big part of the case. It could change if Congress says, I know I have the power, but now I'm handing it to you, Mr. President. I'm giving you enough clarity and enough direction such that I can cede, I can delegate some of my power. That's part of what the government was arguing here. And I think, Vlad, to your question, part of why for the government and for the dissenting justices, it wasn't that clear cut. But what a majority said is Congress didn't delegate this power to the president. Congress didn't use clear terms to say the president gets to impose these sweeping tariffs by using the IEPA. And so what the court did was really spend a lot of time looking at the Constitution, looking at the statute, looking at the specific terms of the statute and saying, it's not this statute. This statute doesn't allow any president to do what this president is claiming it can give him the power to do.
So, Jessica, then let me ask you about the dissent. The dissent says that they believe that Congress intentionally gave the president of the United States broad emergency economic authority. They are also arguing that the court should defer to the executive branch during times of national emergencies, although it was never very clear that we were in a period of national emergency, given that the president would often just impose a tariff on a country that seemed to disagree with him, and he would often do that on social media. And that they also
put out a marketing video
or put out a marketing video.
The US,
exactly
in the case
right.
of Canada.
When Canada put out that video, the president, well, now I'm going to slap tariffs on you. I don't know that that is the definition of a national emergency. And Jessica, finally, the minority, the dissenters, claim that the majority is unnecessarily, and this might be an interesting point to discuss, unnecessarily restricting the president's flexibility when it comes to foreign affairs. Break that down for me.
Great questions. And this really does evidence the split that we saw in the oral arguments, where you did have the government saying that, number one, the president gets broad latitude when it comes to emergencies. Now, you brought up the question of whether or not there is an emergency. This is a separate question of if the president says there's an emergency, who gets to second guess that? Is it unelected members of the judicial branch that get to second guess? Can Congress try and claw back this power and say, no, it's not an emergency? So that's kind of question number one. The president says there's an emergency. The government is saying that gives any president much more power. And then I think bucket number two of what you were reading to us from the dissent is the idea that when it comes to foreign affairs, not just in times of emergency, but even in general times, that we do give the chief executive, again, any president, broad authority to conduct foreign affairs, in part because the president it's not a deliberative branch. The president can move more quickly. And now, basically combining those two things, it's foreign affairs and it's an emergency, the Trump administration said, so we have the power. And I think that was compelling for the dissent here. The idea that if we limit the power here, that we're unnecessarily limiting the power, again, not just of this president, but any president. I think what the majority is saying is, even if you want the president to have greater flexibility and an authority when it comes to emergencies, when it comes to foreign affairs, this isn't the statute that's going to get you there.
For anybody who's just joining us, we are right now covering the breaking news that the Supreme Court says that the president cannot use the Emergency Powers Act to levy tariffs against other countries. We are talking with Jessica Levinson. And before we get into the political implications of which there are many, I want to read another quote, Jessica. This is Full Screen Opinion 8. It is also telling that in IEPA's half century of existence, IEPA being the Emergency Powers Act, no president has invoked this statute to impose any tariffs, let alone tariffs of this magnitude and scope. What is the significance, Jess, that Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion?
So it's significant in the sense that I think we tend to think that these big decisions where you and I will get on the air live and talk about them will always be conservative versus liberal. And what we see today is that's not always how it goes. This is a question of what power does the Constitution give Congress? What power does the Constitution give the president? And what happened in this particular statute? And I think what we're seeing today is what we saw in oral arguments where Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Barrett were looking at this particular statute to link to the quote that you just put up there. They were looking at this statute and they were saying, so nobody has ever tried to impose a tariff under the statute, and then let alone a tariff this broad. And you had Justice Barrett saying to the government, can you point me to any situation where this particular language was used to impose tariffs? And I think, Lindsay, again, to your question, what this shows is the idea that what the justices are doing is looking at words and interpreting their legal meaning. And that doesn't always fall cleanly along ideological lines. We have the Chief Justice, I think from the get-go of the oral arguments, looking at this statute and thinking, this is a big question, and Congress has to do something. He's looking at the non-delegation doctrine. Congress has to be really clear that it's giving the president the authority, that it's delegating its own authority. And I don't think I don't think the Chief Justice thought Congress was giving the president that power. It's really all about the interpretation of the text.
So, Jessica, stand by. I want to bring in senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, who is joining us now to break this down. And Ed, one of the questions that I have for you as I get your reaction to this ruling is what you believe the president's reaction will be. We've seen him, and you will be able to provide unique insight to this because you are constantly, every day, tracking the president, his movements, and his words. Leading up to this decision, the president, even as early as I think it was either this morning or yesterday when he was on Air Force One, and in conversations that he had, just offside conversations in front of cameras to reporters, suggesting that it's a disgrace that this has made its way to the Supreme Court. In other words, he believes that he has the authority to impose these tariffs. What do you think the president, I shouldn't ask you what you think, but what has he said leading up to this decision about how, if this goes against him, how he will feel?
Yeah, he said last month that if the Supreme Court does not uphold his tariffs, quote, we're screwed, adding it would take many years to figure out what number we're talking about and even who, when, and where to pay. In essence, do we have to give back all this money? There's been at least $130 billion in tariff revenue collected since this began last spring. More than 100 companies suing in one way or another to try to force this decision and get refunds for that money. And so this is the very definition of a bad day for any president, to have a signature hallmark underlying policy of virtually everything else he's doing tossed out by the Supreme Court on constitutional grounds. And I'm so glad Jessica Levinson made the point she made, which is that this rises above partisan politics and is about constitutional interpretation of the text. And 6 of the 9 justices said he cannot do this based on a read of the Constitution. We are living, the Trump era is the greatest living, breathing constitutional exercise this country's ever gone through, with the constant question of, can he do that? There's also the should he do that, but there's the can he do that? And we got a very clear answer from the Supreme Court today on the underlying question of who gets to impose tariffs. The answer is Congress. We'll read the texts, Jessica, Jan, Katrina, and others, and the viewers will be able to interpret them as they want to. But bottom line, a president cannot do what he was trying to do with these specific tariff authorities. That does not mean, however, that the administration isn't going to try in other more limited ways. The trade envoy, Jamieson Greer, has said in recent weeks that they would try to seek other kinds of tariffs. So what other kinds could they potentially impose? There's something called the Trade Expansion Act that allows you to potentially put them in place based on national security reasons. So you've seen what they call sectoral tariffs on certain sectors of the economy or industries like aluminum, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, truck parts, medical components. You can do it that way. You can also do it because of concern with discriminatory action taken by specific countries towards the United States. That's why you've seen certain tariffs put on China, for example, or on maritime and logistics shipbuilding sectors that Chinese are involved in. That won't generate nearly as much revenue. That won't help pay for what the Trump administration's been trying to do. But it does suggest that they will keep trying, which may lead to further court cases. The president is in a closed-door meeting right now with Democratic and Republican governors. We don't have a full official guest list, but at least some of the states that sued in this Supreme Court case have their governor in the room with the president right now. He allowed reporters in right at the beginning of it, then immediately kicked them out. And the look on his face, based on years of covering him, suggested he was already in a bad mood. You can only imagine it's going to get worse throughout the rest of today. Vlad.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, stand by, Ed.